We tell ourselves that history is a sequence of events, a line drawn from the past into the now. But what if history is actually a geological weight? What if the ground you are walking on right now is not empty, but full? Beneath every field, beneath every city we take for granted, there are walls that refuse to disappear. Walls that still hold the shape of an empire that ended in fire. We are not just digging into the earth. We are digging into a collective memory that didn't want to be found. And the deeper you go, the more you realize some things aren't lost because they were misplaced. They are lost because we weren't strong enough to bear the truth of them. Welcome back. We are going into the city before it fell. Troy was real. Before the Greeks came, before the ships, before the 10-year war that would become the most famous war in human history, there was a world moving on a completely different axis. The Bronze Age is not the world you know. It is a world without iron, which means every weapon, every plow, every hinge and hook and blade is made of a metal so costly and so difficult to produce that the men who control the mines are the men who control the kingdoms. Bronze is power, actual, literal, extractable power. And Troy, the city the Greeks called Ilium, the city its own people apparently called Wilusa in the old Hittite records, though I find that name still catches me off guard every time. Troy sat at the single most strategically significant point in the ancient world, not because of its walls, though the walls were magnificent. Layered stone rising at angles that still confuse engineers studying the mathematics of their weight. Not the temple either, though the temple burned with oil lamps in honor of gods who took sides in everything. Troy sat at the mouth of the Hellespont, the narrow strait connecting the Aegean Sea to the Black Sea, and in a world of sailboats that could only travel when the wind cooperated, every ship wanting to move from the Mediterranean to the grain-rich north had to wait in the waters below Troy's walls for the wind to change. And while they waited, they paid. Troy collected that toll for generations. Troy became a city of enormous wealth built on nothing more complicated than geography. And wealth like that, accumulated over that much time, looks from the outside like arrogance. It looks like a city that has concluded it cannot be taken. That belief, the belief in one's own inviolability, is always, always the beginning of the end. Before we go further, you need to understand the man inside the walls, the villain, the one the Greeks blamed for everything. Paris, Prince of Troy, youngest relevant son of Priam, who had 50 sons and could not possibly keep track of all of them. Paris, who went to the court of Menelaus of Sparta as a guest, as an emissary of something, and left with Menelaus's wife. Paris is the villain of this story. His desire pulled the ships to shore. But here is what almost no retelling pauses to tell you. Paris was afraid, had been afraid for most of his life. He was the beautiful son, the charming one, the son with no particular gift for war, no natural authority in rooms full of soldiers, no instinct for the brutality that Bronze Age leadership required as minimum qualification. He was a second son, then a third, then further, swallowed by the accumulated reputations of brothers who knew what they were for, always slightly outside the real circle of his own father's court. And when Aphrodite appeared, and I know how that sounds to a modern ear, I feel the pull of the comfortable hedge. but I'm going to resist it, because the ancient world experienced the divine as a force so overwhelming and so personal that distinguishing it from madness would take another 2,000 years of philosophy to even attempt. When she offered him the most beautiful woman in the world, he said yes. He said yes the way anyone says yes to the thing that finally promises to fill the hollow place where confidence should live. Paris was lonely in a way that kingdoms cannot cure, and that loneliness set the ancient world on fire. The law of this universe is simple and brutal. No gift from a god arrives without a cost. The gods choose not to mention. The Trojans knew this. Every civilization in the ancient Mediterranean knew this. The divine operates on a different scale than the human, and when a human accepts something from the divine, a talent, a beauty, a woman, a victory, the price is extracted later, at a moment chosen by something other than the human who made the deal. The Trojans had lived inside this law for generations, built their city on this understanding, made sacrifices, honored the gods of wind and sea and threshold, and for a very long time it worked. For a very long time, the law protected them, until it didn't. Troy, at the time of the war that would destroy it, was the ninth and greatest version of itself. This is what the dig tells you. The excavation beginning in the 1870s, when a German businessman named Heinrich Schliemann, who had read the Iliad as a child and believed it completely, bought rights to excavate a hill in Turkey and moved earth with a ferocity that still makes modern archaeologists wince. He destroyed, in his enthusiasm, layers of history he was too impatient to read. He wanted Homer's Troy. What he found instead was 9 cities stacked one on top of the other like chapters of a book, each built on the rubble of whatever catastrophe destroyed the last. And the layer that matters, the layer called Troy 7a, the one archaeological consensus now places in the period of the war, shows something extraordinary. It shows a city that knew it was going to be attacked. Inside the walls, in the final decades of Troy 7a, houses are small and packed close. The large merchant houses of Troy 6, with their spacious rooms and storage jars sunk into the floors for grain and oil, have been replaced by dense, urgent construction. More people moved inside the walls, more supplies stored, the city contracting, pulling inward, the way a living thing pulls its limbs toward its center when it senses a predator approaching. Troy was not surprised by the Greeks. Troy prepared. That preparation, that decade of siege, that 10-year conversation between 2 armies separated by a wall neither could simply cross. This is what makes it a world rather than a war. You are standing inside those walls now. I should tell you what it smells like, and I find this part harder to write than I expected. Maybe because I want to get it right. It is not incense and marble. It is grain dust and animal dung and cook fire smoke, and beneath all of that, under everything, the faint salt copper smell of the Aegean carried up on the wind from the water below. The streets are narrow. These are the streets of a city under siege, which means the streets of a city that has been feeding itself from its own stores for years, rationing, managing, watching the jars of oil diminish and calculating how long the walls can compensate for the gap between what the city produces and what the city needs. Children play in these streets, but they are thin. the soldiers rotating the same wall posts for years, some of them unable to remember with full clarity what peacetime felt like. The great King Priam, who had 50 sons at the beginning of this, has fewer now. Hector is still alive. Hector, the greatest of the Trojan warriors, the man even Achilles respects with the specific respect of one apex predator for another. Hector still walks the streets in the evening before his duty on the walls, and the city holds its shape around him the way a body holds its shape around a spine. Let me collect the thread here, because there is something easy to miss. Every person inside this city is living inside a choice they did not make. The choice was made by Paris, and every woman who sent her husband to the wall, every mother rationing grain for her children, every old man who remembers when the ships on the Hellespont were trading ships, all of them are existing inside the consequences of one man's brief moment of yes. The weight of that, the specific weight of being trapped inside someone else's desire, someone else's emptiness, someone else's decision, doesn't appear in the poems as clearly as bronze spear tips. But it is there, baked into the pressed earth floors of every house in Troy 7a. The city is paying a toll it did not set, and it has no mechanism to stop paying. Anyway, the Greeks on the beach below are their own world. Homer gives you individual greatness. He gives you Achilles, greatest warrior who ever lived, and Odysseus, cleverest man who ever schemed, and Agamemnon, the king of kings who can barely manage the egos in his own camp, and Ajax, who is simply, he's just the largest human being in the ancient world, and his tactical understanding of war is approximately the same as his understanding of poetry, which is to say, brute and sincere. Homer also gives you, if you read it slowly enough and in the right kind of darkness, the human underneath each profile. Achilles sulks in his tent for most of the Iliad because Agamemnon disrespected him. You can read that as childish pride, or you can read it as the rage of a man who has been told his entire life that his only value is the violence he can perform, who built his whole identity on excellence at one specific thing, and who finds himself, when that excellence is questioned, with no other self to reach for. Achilles is not simply arrogant. Achilles is a man who does not know who he is when he is not the best at killing. That is a kind of poverty no amount of divine blood can address. The beach between the Greek camp and the Trojan walls is what scholars call the liminal space of the Iliad, the threshold, neither here nor there. On one side, the city. On the other, the camp. Between them, the plain of the Scammander, the river plain where most of the actual war happens, where the bodies of men from both sides have been fertilizing the same soil for 10 years, where the river Scamander himself, because in this world, rivers have personalities and loyalties and the capacity for rage, has been so choked with Greek dead that he rises in furious flood against Achilles. I want to stay on that image for a moment because I think it is one of the most extraordinary images in ancient literature, and I am not sure I can explain exactly why it keeps striking me. A hero so effective at killing that a river becomes his enemy. The landscape itself rising in protest. There is something in that I keep circling. The plain is where the story lives, in the dust and blood and brief moments of individual clarity that happen when a man looks across 10 yards of contested ground and sees in his enemy's face something uncomfortably like himself, like looking into a lake that is also slightly... No, it is like looking into something that was supposed to show only the enemy and shows, instead, everything. That simile did not quite seal. Somewhere in all of this, there is a thing inside Troy that has no real parallel in any mythology before or since. A woman standing on a tower, watching the war that began because of her. She is naming the heroes, explaining to old King Priam, who cannot see well enough at this distance to identify individual men on the plain below, which Greek commander is which. Helen of Troy, Helen of Sparta, Helen, who is either the most beautiful woman in the world or the most powerful symbol the ancient world ever generated for the concept of a thing worth having. She is standing on the wall of the city, destroyed by her presence inside it, narrating the destruction with a precision that implies 10 years of very close observation. What she knows about the Greek commanders is the knowledge of a woman who has been paying attention, thinking, calculating towards some conclusion the poem never quite reveals. That open calculation, it is still unresolved. The silence where her conclusion should be. The city waits. The wind comes up off the water. Somewhere below, on the plain, two armies are doing what they have been doing for a decade. Helen watches. The jars of grain go down. Hector walks the evening street. And somewhere in the palace, Paris. Who started this? Who said yes to the thing that promised to fill what was empty? Paris exists in a city that has never forgiven him, surrounded by a war he cannot fight well, inside a story that will outlast everything he thought he was reaching for. Troy fell, but not yet. The plan was Odysseus's. It was always going to be his. 10 years of watching the greatest military operation the ancient world had ever assembled run itself bloody against walls that would not yield. 10 years of plague and supply failures, and the particular exhaustion of men who have been fighting long enough to stop remembering what they are fighting for. And what Odysseus understood, finally, what he alone in that camp seems to have arrived at, is that the problem was never military. Never. The walls of Troy were a psychological problem, and psychological problems are not solved by rams or ladders or the massed momentum of better soldiers. The horse was not a trick. I want to be precise about that, or, I'm not sure, precision is exactly the right word. I want to be careful about it. The wooden horse was not, in any meaningful original sense, a simple deception. It was a story. A structure built to carry a story inside it. And the story was calibrated with a sophistication that still impresses me when I sit with it long enough. Odysseus built a narrative and placed it inside timber and relied on the Trojans' own deepest need to do the rest. That's the part that doesn't come through in the quick retellings. The work wasn't carpentry. The work was psychology. Here is what the plan required. The fleet had to disappear. Every ship. The beach that had been a city in itself for 10 years, tents, forges, the smell of 1,000 cook fires, the low, constant noise of an army with nowhere to go. That beach had to go silent overnight. They sailed to Tenedos, just over the horizon, close enough to return by dark. And the Trojans woke up on what would be the last ordinary morning their civilization would ever produce, and they heard nothing. Quiet after 10 years. They opened the gates. Of course they did. What else do you do after a decade? when the pressure is suddenly gone. The Trojans walked out onto the plain they hadn't been able to cross without dying. They walked to the water. They touched the cold ash where the Greek fires had been. And then someone found the horse, enormous, built from ship planks, and enormous, and this is the part I find difficult to describe in any way that doesn't sound like I'm reaching. There was something about the beauty of it. Objects made with that quality of care carry their own weight. It sat on the beach as though it had simply arrived there, and beside it, one man, one Greek soldier left behind, left alone on a hostile shore. His name was Sinon, and he had volunteered for this, had raised his hand when Odysseus asked for a man willing to be captured and questioned under conditions that might include being killed, and willing, throughout all of that, to tell a story convincingly enough to deceive an entire city. When the Trojans brought Sinon before old Priam, he told the story Odysseus had built for him. The horse was an offering to Athena. The Greeks had offended her. Odysseus had stolen her sacred image from her temple in Troy, the Palladium, and the goddess had turned against the Greek fleet with plague and storm, and so they had built this gift of appeasement before sailing home. They built it enormous precisely so the Trojans could not bring it inside their walls, because the prophet Calchas had said, if Troy takes his horse into the city will never fall. Let me collect the thread here, because this is where the plan's real sophistication lives. Sinon's story was calibrated to Troy's specific psychology. This was a city that had survived 10 years of siege by holding divine favor, sacrifice, worship, the scrupulous maintenance of sacred obligations. That was the architecture of Trojan survival, the thing underneath the stone walls. And here was a Greek, an enemy, presenting them with evidence that the Greeks had lost that favor and offering them a mechanism to gain it absolutely and permanently. A divine guarantee. Just bring the horse inside. The temptation was enormous. The story was perfect. And then it almost failed. The priest Laomedon walked the horse and drove his spear into its side, and from inside the wood came a sound, a shifting, a clattering, the sound of men folded together in darkness, trying not to breathe. And Laomedon turned to his city. His warning is the most famous in all of human history. I fear the Greeks, even bearing gifts. The evidence was physical. The sound was real. His spear was real, anyway. At that moment, 2 enormous sea serpents rose from the water and crushed Laomedon and his sons to death in front of the assembled Trojans. And the Trojans, who needed, with a desperation 10 years deep, to believe the war was over, read this as divine punishment. Laomedon was wrong. The gods had corrected him. The horse was sacred. Bring it in. Cassandra was there. She stood in the street, the princess of Troy, the woman given prophecy by Apollo, and the curse that no one would believe her. And she described the burning of her city in specific detail. She stood there and said exactly what was about to happen to every person within earshot. Nobody listened. This is the detail I keep returning to, the one that presses against something, not the horse, not the fire. Cassandra, a woman who knew the exact shape of the catastrophe, who described it with perfect clarity to the people with the power to stop it, and was disregarded, because accepting the truth would have meant giving up 10 years of endurance, would have meant admitting that the suffering had been for nothing, would have meant saying no to the one object that promised release. We tell ourselves the truth teller is wrong. We construct reasons. We watch the serpents take the priest, and we decide the gods have spoken, and we bring the horse inside the walls, and the gates close behind it, and we open the wine that has been sealed for exactly this kind of victory. And we drink, and we sing, and we light fires that are not signals but celebrations, and the light from those fires rises into the sky over the dark Aegean. The Greek fleet, anchored at Tenedos, watching the horizon, saw the glow and waited. The night deepened. The wine did what wine does to soldiers who have been sleeping in fear for 10 years. Troy went quiet, and in the belly of the horse, in the dark inside the planks, in the space where 30 or 40 men had been pressed together in sweat and held breath for hours, Sinon opened the door. The Greeks came out and killed the guards and opened the walls to the fleet returning under cover of darkness. Troy burned. There is an archaeological stratum beneath the soil of what we call Troy 7a, dated to approximately 1180 BCE, that is ash, charred wood, collapsed walls consistent with catastrophic and rapid fire. The burning of Troy is not, I keep writing, not only a poem, and then deleting it because the qualification feels inadequate. What I mean is the ground holds the memory of it. Ash, bronze arrow tips, storage jars cracked by heat, a spindle whirl, a terracotta figurine, a horse carved in ivory that someone loved enough to carry through the burning and was not fortunate enough to save. The Greeks took Troy after 10 years. The walls fell. Priam, who had watched his city survive everything for a decade, was killed at his own household altar, the altar of Zeus Hercaios. I'm not sure why I've always found that specific detail the hardest one, the intimacy of where he died, the particular sacrilege of that location. And in the theology of the Bronze Age, killing a man at his household altar poisoned a victory from the inside, left something in it, some wrongness that would work outward. Agamemnon went home with slaves and treasure and walked into his palace and was murdered by his wife. She had been waiting 10 years with a patience that had nothing to do with love. Odysseus, who had won the war, went home, except home required 10 more years. Monsters, gods, Poseidon's sustained fury, 10 years of watching every man who had sailed with him die one by one until he arrived alone, in disguise, at a house full of men eating his food and courting his wife and assuming he was dead. The victors were more destroyed by the victory than the Trojans were by the defeat. That asymmetry, I don't have a clean way to end with it. I'm not sure I'm supposed to. The story doesn't end exactly. It pressurizes into something else. Aeneas walking out of burning Troy carrying his father on his back, carrying the household gods under his arm, he carries the future, is the thing. Walks out of the burning, and the future follows him. And the Greeks sail home into the wreckage of themselves. The plane is quiet now. 10 years of noise, and it's quiet. The ash cools. The ground holds what it holds. So there. Here is where the myth stops being about Troy. Or, that's the wrong way to put it. The myth was never only about Troy. What I mean is, here is where the distance collapses, where the 10 years and the walls and the burning city press up against whatever you are carrying right now. In whatever room you are in whatever hour this is for you, how many victories have felt like this? How many times has the thing you spent years, actual years, the years of your actual life pursuing revealed itself at the moment of its achievement to be hollow at the center? The Greeks went to Troy for glory, for honor, for the demonstration of Greek unity and Greek power, for the recovery of a stolen queen. And those things were achieved, technically, in the narrowest sense of achieved. But the cost was 10 years of lives. The cost was the destruction of the civilization they were supposedly fighting to defend. The cost was survivors going home into situations worse than the ones they left. And the particular silence that followed, the silence that falls after you have obtained the thing and discovered that obtaining it did not do what you believed obtaining it would do. That silence is not a Bronze Age silence. It is still being produced constantly by ordinary people in ordinary lives standing in the ash of their own achieved ambitions, trying to understand why it doesn't feel the way it was supposed to feel. The wanting stops. Nothing fills the space the wanting occupied. The Bronze Age collapse is the name historians give to what happened next, and I've always found it an insufficient name for what was, by any measure, one of the most total civilizational implosions in human history. Within a 50-year window around 1200 BCE, the world that had produced Troy and the Greek heroes and the war that burned between them simply ended. The Mycenaean palace economies, the Hittite Empire, Ugarit, which had been one of the great trading cities of the ancient Mediterranean, and which was destroyed so rapidly that archaeologists found a letter in the ruins mid-dictation describing an attack that was already underway when the scribe was writing. Egypt disrupted. A dozen other civilizations disrupted or destroyed. The cause or causes remain genuinely contested. Climate, drought, the sea peoples, internal systems collapse, some cascading combination of all of it. And I want to be careful here about overstating what we know, because this is one of those places where I feel the ground become uncertain under the argument. And I would rather tell you the uncertainty exists than pretend it doesn't. What we know is the ash. What we know is the silence in the record. What we know is the speed. The Bronze Age world was extraordinary. I linger here because I think this part gets rushed past in most tellings, and it deserves the full stop. This was a world of palace administrators maintaining linear B tablets, the writing system the Greeks had and then forgot and would not recover for 5 centuries, recording the precise quantities of grain owed to specific workers on specific days. This was a world of diplomatic correspondence between kings who called each other brother and negotiated marriages and trade agreements with a sophistication that rivals. I keep wanting to make a contemporary comparison and then pulling back from it. It was sophisticated. The copper came from Cyprus, the tin from Afghanistan, the grain from Egypt, the purple dye from Phoenicia. A web of mutual dependencies so intricate and so precisely calibrated that when one thread pulled, the whole structure came apart with a totality that nobody inside it could have predicted or prepared for. Let me collect the thread. The Greeks who sailed home from Troy sailed home into a world already beginning to forget how to read. within a generation, the palace economies were gone. Within a few generations, the writing system was gone. And the classical Greeks, the ones who built the Parthenon, who wrote the tragedies, who argued philosophy in the afternoon light, those Greeks had no memory of the Bronze Age that was not mythological. They did not know they had once had writing. They did not know their ancestors had administered trade networks spanning the known world. They only had the poems, the stories carried forward in the one technology that survived everything, the human voice, one mouth to one ear, generation after generation, across 500 years of smaller and quieter and darker. The voice kept it. Now the voice quiets a little, because we've arrived at the question underneath all of this. And the question is not the kind that announces itself. It sits there. The Iliad carries it without stating it. The ash layer in the earth at Hisarlik holds it without words. And the question is this: what are you inside the walls of? I'm aware this sounds like it's about to become something therapeutic, and I want to resist that framing. That's a different conversation and a different set of tools. What I mean is structural, mythological. Every person has built around something central, a belief, a relationship, a version of themselves they are committed to, a story about how their life is going to resolve. Walls. And the walls feel protective. The walls are the thing that makes endurance possible. You can ration and wait and hold the line and keep the gates closed as long as the walls mean something, as long as there is a clear distinction between the inside and the outside, and a clear reason for maintaining it. The Trojans built walls that lasted 10 years against the most powerful military force the ancient world had assembled. The walls held. The walls were fine. The walls were never the problem. The problem was what came through the gate. The problem was the moment when people exhausted by a decade of endurance, people who needed the war to be over with a desperation that had by then become physical, structural, woven into the daily fabric of how they moved through the city. The problem was the moment those people chose to believe a story they should have examined more carefully. The Greeks did not defeat Troy through force. Troy made a decision, an understandable decision, a very human decision, a decision I find it impossible to judge from 3,000 years of distance, because I think I would have made it too, and it was catastrophic. Anyway, how many times have you opened the gate? I don't mean that rhetorically, or I do mean it rhetorically, but I also mean it specifically, in the way that myths mean things specifically when they've survived long enough. How many times has a story been so perfectly constructed, so precisely calibrated to the thing you most needed to hear at the moment you most needed to hear it, that you accepted it before you finished listening to it? Because that is what Sinon's story was. That is the sophistication of what Odysseus built. He built something that answered a 10-year hunger, and the Trojans were hungry. The question has no answer. I want to be honest about that. It is the kind of question that the dark holds while you rest in it. 3,000 years of telling this particular story to every kind of person in every kind of situation the human world produces. And the question remains unresolved because the people who recognize it keep recognizing it fresh, keep arriving at their own version of the gate, keep standing in the torchlight. It's like arriving at a door that is shaped exactly like every important decision you have ever made, which is not quite the image I wanted, but I'm leaving it. Troy burned. People came back. This is the part I find I can't quite adequately account for, the part that sits with me when the rest of the story has settled. 9 layers of city on that hill, each one built on the ash of its predecessor, each one carrying forward the essential need that all cities carry, the need for walls, for the inside, for the structure of protected belonging. The Bronze Age collapsed with a totality that nobody inside it could have survived with their civilization intact. Ugarit burned, Mycenae declined, the writing disappeared, and still, people came back to that particular hill above the Hellespont and built again, smaller at first, then larger, then, centuries later, a Roman city, then Byzantine. The hill is still occupied. The hill has always been occupied, catastrophe after catastrophe, because the need that built Troy the first time is the same need that built it the 8th time and the 9th. It doesn't exhaust itself. It doesn't learn a lesson about fire and ash and the dangers of beautiful wooden gifts. It just builds. The silence after Troy fell is not absence. It is accumulation. 9 cities of human life pressed into a hill, layer on layer, each carrying the ash of the one before, each carrying also the objects, the spindle whorl, the terracotta figurine, the ivory horse someone loved and lost in the burning. And this is the thing I cannot prove but believe. What the ash layer tells you is a consolation, if you let it be. The worst things in the oldest stories are also true. The burning cities are also real, and the fact that they are real means that the experience of building walls and enduring siege and opening the gate to the thing that changes everything is ancient beyond reckoning. It is older than writing. The Trojans are not a warning. They are a company. They are the evidence that this has always been the shape of it. Endurance and catastrophe, and the hollow moment after the obtaining, the silence after the victory, all of it ancient, shared, the particular shape of the human thing held in the earth. The ground kept Troy. The question stays. The walls you have built, the sound, if you listen. Let the weight of the walls stay here tonight, in the dark, where it belongs. Let the question about the gate sit at the foot of wherever you are resting, unhurried, belonging to the same ancient category as all questions that have no resolution before morning. Let the fire on the hill be what you carry into sleep, not the ending fire, not the catastrophe fire, but the older one, the one that was burning in the city before the war began. The fire in the temple lamps, the fire in the cook stoves, the daily fire of a city full of people who woke every morning and did what cities do, fed children, tended walls, argued about the price of grain, fell in love in narrow streets, watched the water below for ships that always came bearing something, trade or trouble or the particular wind that smells of salt, and things that cannot be taken back once set in motion. That fire, the daily fire, the fire of a city that was real and became ash and was found again beneath the earth by a man who believed too completely and dug too carelessly and was right anyway. Let that be what stays with you. If this story carried you somewhere tonight, if the walls rose around you and the wind of the Aegean felt real and the weight of 10 years inside a besieged city pressed against your chest, in a way that had nothing to do with Troy. Then there is more waiting. The next part descends into the underworld, into the kingdom that receives all the dead of the war, Greek and Trojan alike, the place where Achilles says the thing about glory and death that no one who hears it ever quite recovers from. All you have to do is return. The hill above the Hellespont is still there. The walls are still there, in pieces, in the earth. The question is still there, and the ash is still warm. If you press your hand deep enough, if you go all the way down to the layer that was real, the layer the earth kept for 3,000 years against the possibility that someone would come looking. Good night. Welcome back. The hill is not what you expect. This is the first thing I want to say, and I find it strangely hard to convey. The gap between what the imagination builds for Troy and what the actual hill at Hisarlik is. The imagination builds cliffs, towers catching the Mediterranean light at a height that announces significance. The hill at Hisarlik is low, gentle even. The plain around it is flat in the way of coastal plains everywhere. The flat of a alluvial deposit, of a landscape that has been accumulating silt from two rivers for thousands of years. The Semois and the Scamander, both running to the Aegean just north of the hill. From a ship coming south through the Hellespont, a ship carrying timber or silver or amber from the Baltic, arriving in the approaches to the strait where Asia and Europe nearly touch across the narrowing water. From that ship, in the gold-bronze light of a late afternoon, the hill would catch the eye, not through size, through what sat on it, a city visible from the water, towers that would have been the first human architecture a sailor saw coming south through the strait, the first confirmation that the world of organized human power was near. Welcome to the edge of Asia. Welcome to the place where the Bronze Age concentrated itself into walls. The walls. I want to stay here a moment, because I think the walls are where most retellings fail through impatience. And I am aware I have a tendency to linger on the things that interest me and rush past the things that merely deserve attention, and the walls deserve more than I usually give them. The popular imagination has given Troy walls of gleaming marble, Homeric walls, walls proportioned for heroes and the gaze of gods. The actual walls of Troy 7a are limestone and mud brick, layered in the Anatolian tradition. The lower courses are heavy stone blocks, fitted without mortar, each block's weight and angle calculated to distribute the load of everything above. The upper courses are mud brick, sun-dried to a hardness that surprised the first archaeologists who encountered it. Hardness that had survived 3,000 years of burial and the weight of 8 subsequent cities pressing down from above. The walls were built to prevent a specific thing. They were built with full knowledge of what they needed to hold against. And they held 10 years. This is the fact that most retellings rush past in the urgency of arriving at the horse and the fire. The walls held. For 10 years, the greatest military force the Bronze Age world assembled could not breach them. Could not. The Greeks fought on the plain and at the gates. The Scamander ran with blood from both armies. Hector went out from the gates every morning and came back every evening, and the city was still there. Troy's achievement was survival, a decade of survival against a siege that should have ended in months. The Iliad knows this. The word Ilion, the name the Trojans used for their own city, the name spoken from inside rather than outside, appears in the poem more often than Troy does. That detail matters to me in a way I find difficult to fully articulate. I've kept it. Let me collect the thread, because I've wandered into the walls when I meant to start with the ground, before the siege, before the myth. You need to understand what Troy was as an economic entity in the late Bronze Age, because that understanding changes the meaning of everything that happened to it. The Bronze Age Mediterranean ran on palace economies. Large administrative centers, palaces, controlled the production and distribution of goods across wide territories. The palace at Mycenae, the palace at Knossos, the Hittite king's palace at Hattusa, the pharaoh's palace in Egypt. These were the nodes of a network that moved goods across distances we are still reconstructing from the archaeology. Copper from Cyprus, tin from Afghanistan, grain from Egypt, purple dye from Phoenicia. Troy's role in this network was specific, and I find this part genuinely fascinating in a way that makes me want to slow down. And I'm gonna let myself. Troy's role was the gateway, the toll gate city, the city whose wealth came from position rather than production. The Hellespont runs against you if you're sailing north. The current flows south, out of the Black Sea, consistently and strongly, and ships traveling north against it needed a favorable southern wind that only came reliably in summer, which meant waiting. Ships bound for the Black Sea anchored in the protected water below the hill at Hisarlik and waited for the wind, sometimes days, sometimes weeks. Troy provided water, supplies, safe anchorage. Troy charged for these things, and the charge, paid by every ship moving between the Aegean world and the Black Sea world, paid generation after generation after generation, built the walls, stocked the storerooms, supported the court of Priam with its 50 sons and its priests and its merchants, and the whole dense social organism of a city that had been sitting on the most valuable piece of real estate in the ancient Mediterranean for centuries. The war was, in one reading, a war about the toll. Anyway, Helen is the mythological frame for why an entire civilization would commit a decade of military capacity to a single objective across the Aegean. A stolen queen, a violation of the sacred guest-friend compact, an affront to divine order requiring divine-scale response. That frame works. It works across 3,000 years of retelling, which is its own argument for its adequacy. Underneath the frame is the Hellespont and the accumulated wealth of a city that had been charging for the wind for generations. And I want to be careful here not to suggest that uncovering the economic logic diminishes the myth. It grounds it. It gives the abstraction of glory a material skeleton, explains why rational actors would spend 10 years and the lives of their best men on this particular hill above this particular strait. Helen was real and important. I want to say that plainly. The specific woman, Spartan queen, daughter of a god, wife of Menelaus, the person who went or was taken to Troy and watched from the walls of a city that burned because of her presence in it. That specific individual is not recoverable. The evidence doesn't reach her. But Helen, as the distillation of everything the Greek world understood about value and desire, and the catastrophic arithmetic of certain kinds of wanting, that Helen is as real as the ash layer And that Helen is why the myth outlasted the toll road history by 30 centuries and counting. The historians recovered the economics 100 years ago. The myth never needed recovery. It was always there. It never left the voice. Troy as a gateway, Troy as an economic position, Troy as the place where two worlds touched across narrowing water and one city grew rich on the friction. These facts don't cool the fire. They explain the fire's size. They explain why the Greeks stayed, why the kings kept their armies on that beach for 10 years instead of sailing home to their own political problems, their own harvests, their own restless populations. The prize justified the cost. And Helen, beautiful, watching from the walls, naming the Greek commanders to old Priam with the fluency of a woman who had been paying very close attention for a very long time. Helen is the prize made into a person, or the person made into a prize. I'm not sure those are different things in the world the myth describes. The Bronze Age didn't distinguish them cleanly. Neither do we, entirely. Almost surfacing here, some contemporary reflex, and then it passes. This is not that conversation. Back to the hill. The wall stood for 10 years. The economics of the Hellespont made the war rational. The myth made it immortal. And underneath all three of these facts, underneath the poetry and the archaeology and the Bronze Age trade routes and the diplomatic correspondence between kings who called each other brother and meant it as a term of contractual obligation, underneath all of it is the hill, low, unassuming, the plain around it flat, two rivers running to the water, the ash in the ground, the hill, the ash, the question you carried in from last night, still sitting at the foot of where you rest. It kept its shape through everything I just told you. So there, the world of the Iliad is a world of men. Famously, deliberately, structurally a world of men. A poem about warriors and male honor and the specific brutal arithmetic of Bronze Age aristocratic culture, in which a man's worth is measured by his excellence in violence and his skill in assembly and his ability to accumulate and hold kleos, glory, the reputation that outlasts the body because other people keep speaking it. The worst thing that can happen in this world is obscurity, the name going quiet. Achilles is given a choice by his divine mother Thetis, who knows how the story ends. A long, undistinguished life, home to Phthia, forgotten, or early death at Troy and permanent remembrance. He chooses Troy. He chooses the story over the years, the kleos over the warmth of ordinary duration, the fire over the long cool of surviving. And the Iliad then spends its entire remaining length making sure you understand what that choice costs. What it actually, specifically, materially costs. What is consumed in the burning. But the women, I want to stay with the women of the Iliad for a while, because this is the part I find myself thinking about longest after the poem closes. And I think the reason is that the poem is doing something genuinely strange with them. It does not center them, does not give them the structural attention it gives Achilles or Hector or even Agamemnon, and at the same time, it does not erase them. And what it gives them in the spaces between the battle catalogues is devastating in a way that feels almost inadvertent. Almost. I don't think Homer was careless. I think the devastation is the point. Andromache, Hector's wife, She stands on the wall with their infant son Astyanax and watches Hector walk out to face Achilles. And the poem makes clear, it is explicit about this, that she knows he is walking out to die. She does not ask him to hide. She is too intelligent for that, and she knows him too well for that. Instead, she makes a logistical argument for his survival. She tells him what his death will cost in practical terms. She will be a widow, the boy fatherless, the city without its best defender. She is making the case for his life in the only register that might reach him through the full weight of heroic code he's wrapped himself in. And it does not work because the heroic code is designed with precise intentionality to insulate the hero against exactly this kind of appeal. The code's entire function is to make the man unavailable to the people who love him. Hector leaves. He dies. And Andromache, somewhere in the city when his death cry reaches her, drops the loom she's working at. The threads scatter across the floor. That detail, the loom, the dropped threads. I have read a lot of ancient poetry, and I am trying to think of a more compressed image for what war does to the people outside the heroic frame, and I cannot find one. The threads of ordinary life scatter, and no one picks them up, because the poem is about the war, and the weaving is not the war. But the threads are still on the floor, and the poem knows they're there, and makes sure you see them before it moves on. Hecuba is Priam's wife. She loses sons across the 10 years of the war. Hector is the one the poem follows closely, but Priam had 50 sons at the start, and the siege has been working through them. Hecuba watches from the walls with the attention of a woman who has been watching from walls for a very long time and has constructed, from what she can see and hear, and from what comes back through the gates in the evenings, her own complete understanding of the war and its shape. She prays to Athena in the temple with the desperation of a mother who has exhausted every other resource. Athena does not answer. Athena is on the Greek side, has been since the judgment of Paris, since the moment the goddess of wisdom and craft lost a beauty contest to Aphrodite and directed the full weight of her divine resentment at the city that chose against her. Hecuba prays. Athena is silent. The walls hold another day. I need to pause here because we've arrived at Cassandra, and Cassandra requires the full stop. The gift came from Apollo, who loved her and bestowed the ability to see the future before she refused him. The gift, once given, was permanent. Divine gifts don't retract. So he added a condition. She would always know what was coming and would never be believed. I find this psychologically the most sophisticated thing in the entire myth, and I want to try to explain why. Because I think it usually gets summarized in a way that misses what's actually being described. The curse does not work on the ears of the people who hear Cassandra. It works on their assessment of her as a source. She is the woman who has been saying the worst possible thing is coming for years. She has been saying it in the mode of ancient prophecy, which is possessed and extreme, and over years of extreme warnings that did not materialize. The Trojans built a heuristic, a reasonable one. This person says extreme things. Extreme things have not happened. Therefore, this person's extreme things can be discounted. The heuristic is wrong on the last night, but it was formed reasonably from available evidence. This is the impossibility of the Cassandra position. and it does not resolve into a clean lesson. The frequency of her warnings destroyed the authority of each individual warning. The very accuracy that should have established her credibility. She was always right, every single time, produced through its accumulation something that was functionally indistinguishable from pathology. She could not be believed because she was always right in a way that looked like always wrong. And so she stands in the street on the last night and describes the burning with full precision, and the Trojans opened the gate. Anyway, Odysseus was inside the horse himself. This sometimes gets lost. He directed the operation, but he was also inside it, folded into the dark with the others, which tells you something about him that the Iliad's portrait of him as primarily a schemer can obscure. He was also a man who took the risks he asked of others. He sat in the dark belly of the horse for hours while the sounds of Troy's celebration came through the wood, singing, then the particular noise of serious drinking, then the gradual quiet of a city going to sleep on the best night it had had in 10 years. And Odysseus waited. He was very good at waiting. The Odyssey gives him 10 more years of it. What the first man out of that horse experienced, dropping from the belly of the thing into the sleeping streets, standing in the dark of a city that didn't yet know he was there. I keep trying to construct this moment and running into the edge of what I can actually know. There is no witness account. There is no record of the sensation. I've kept trying to describe it anyway, because I think the attempt is worth making even when it comes up short. The sudden cold after the compressed warmth inside the wood, the smell of the celebration still in the air, the embers of cook fires, the specific quality of a city that has drunk deeply and slept hard, the silence that follows relief so profound it becomes unconsciousness. The guards at the gate already dealt with by whoever came out first. The gate itself, a gate that had held for 10 years, now moving on its pivots for the first time in a decade without the weight of the city's authority behind it. Open, the fleet had sailed back through the dark. The beach that had been silent for one day was full again. The Greeks came through the gate with the efficiency of men who have been planning this for 10 years and have no interest in anything except ending it. They moved through the streets. They did what Bronze Age armies did to cities they took by night. The myth tends not to dwell on the general texture of this. It selects the hero moments, the named deaths, the scenes with sufficient narrative architecture to survive retelling. Neoptolemus killing Priam at the household altar, Ajax the Lesser dragging Cassandra from the temple of Athena, which was, there's a modern reflex here, some vocabulary that almost surfaces, and then I pull it back. The ancient world had its own categories. They were not gentler, they were just differently named. Menelaus finds Helen in the burning city. He raises his sword, then lowers it. The versions differ on the details of this moment, the specific words, the specific look between them, but the most persistent version across the tradition is consistent on the essential fact. He raises the sword and lowers it. He looks at her and cannot do the thing that 10 years of war had seemed to make both necessary and inevitable. 10 years of a war fought in her name, for the recovery of her, the restoration of his honor through her return, and he is standing in the burning city holding a sword over the woman who is the reason all of it happened. The reason every man who died on the plain below those walls is dead. And he lowers it because he looks at her. I'm not sure what I think about this moment. I've thought about it for longer than I can justify in these notes, and I still don't have a fixed position. It is either the most human thing in the entire myth or the most troubling, or some combination that the myth itself refuses to resolve. The war ends in that moment, in some essential internal sense, even as the fire continues to move from roof to roof, and the sounds of the fighting go on through the night, and the city that held for 10 years finishes falling in the time it takes for fire to find the next thing to consume. The sword comes down, the fire goes on, Troy goes, the sword comes down, the war ends. That's the gesture, a sword not falling, a thing not completed, the most anticlimactic possible conclusion to the most extreme possible 10-year commitment. The claimed justification for all of it, the recovery of the stolen queen, resolves into Menelaus standing in the burning city, looking at Helen and lowering his arm. 10 years, and then that. Helen. The myth always returns to Helen. Always. And I want to try to hold this question with the seriousness it requires, because it is usually handled in one of two ways. Either Helen is a victim of abduction, and the question of her willingness is settled, or she is a willing participant, and that settles it the other direction. And the myth itself refuses both settlements with what I can only describe as deliberate and sustained refusal. Homer's Iliad gives you a Helen who is clearly uncomfortable, who wraps herself in grief and self-recrimination, who stands on the wall naming the Greek heroes with the easy familiarity of someone who has been watching them for 10 years and knows them well, who speaks of herself with a harshness that might be genuine remorse and might be the performance of remorse that an intelligent woman in an impossible position performs in order to hold on to whatever standing she can manage in a city that blames her for everything. The Odyssey gives you a different Helen entirely, composed, authoritative, telling stories about Troy at a dinner table in Sparta with the confident narrative control of a woman who has fully processed her own experience and arrived at a version she is comfortable inhabiting. The other texts give you other Helens, Helen as fully willing, Helen as completely unwilling, Helen as a woman who chose with full knowledge of the cost, Helen as a woman who was taken and made the best of it. And then there is the tradition, Euripides, his play Helen, in which she was never in Troy at all. I find I can't move past this one quickly, and I'm going to let myself stay here longer than is probably proportionate, because this is the version that sits in the dark and does not release. In this telling, Zeus or Hermes substituted a phantom for the real woman, a copy made of cloud, and the real Helen spent the entire 10 years of the war in Egypt, faithful, waiting, intact, while 10,000 men died on both sides for a shape of nothing. The hollow victory, taken to its outermost logical edge, they won. They recovered what they were fighting for, and what they were fighting for had never been there. The real thing was elsewhere the whole time. Euripides presents this, and then does not tell you what to do with it. He lets it sit in the space where certainty should be, And it has been sitting there for 2,500 years, and it is still sitting there. The possibility that the most famous war in human history was fought for an absence dressed as a presence, a hollow at the center of everything. I need to pause here, because we've arrived at the archaeology, and the archaeology does not resolve any of this, and I want to be precise about why. What the dig at Hisarlik tells you is this: there was a city. It was prosperous. It was strategically important. It was destroyed by fire, catastrophically and rapidly, around 1180 BCE. After the destruction, the site was abandoned briefly and then reoccupied by a different population, archaeologically distinct, which built on the ash and continued to build for centuries afterward. Those are the facts the ground holds. The archaeology is about material culture. The mythology is about meaning. They coexist in the same hill and the same burn layer, and they answer different questions and conflating them, pretending the ash layer settles the question of Helen, or that the walls settle the question of Achilles' choices, is the error that has tripped up everyone from Schliemann onward. Schliemann. He was right in the most inconvenient possible way. Right about the essential claim, wrong about almost every specific. Right that Homer's Troy was a real place. Wrong about which layer of stratigraphy it was. He found the burned treasure of Troy too, a settlement 2,000 years older than the Troy of the war, and called it the treasure of Priam. And he was wrong, and in the process of being wrong, he destroyed some of the most important evidence for what the site actually was. He found what he was looking for and misidentified it and damaged it. The treasure is now split between the Pushkin Museum in Moscow and the Istanbul Archaeological Museum, and the question of its ownership is as unresolved as anything in the myth itself. He was wrong. He opened a door. Anyway, the careful work came after. Dörpfeld, who worked the site after Schliemann and identified 9 distinct cities in the stratigraphy. Then Carl Blegen in the 1930s, who proposed that Troy 7, not the more architecturally impressive Troy 6, matched the Homeric War. Then Manfred Kaufmann, directing excavations from 1988 until his death in 2005, who made the discovery that changed the scale of everything. A lower city, below the citadel, extending down the slope in all directions, a city of houses and streets and workshops and storehouses. The total inhabited area of Troy, once the lower city was mapped, increased by a factor of 10. Troy was a city of perhaps 10,000 people at its height, one of the largest cities in the Bronze Age Aegean. The walls of the citadel, the walls everyone pictures when they picture Troy, protected the palace and the temples and the administrative core. The life of the city lived below, in the lower city that the soil kept and Kaufmann found, and that changed what was lost when the fire came. 10,000 people. The poems give you Achilles, Hector, Priam, Paris, Cassandra, Andromache, Helen, Hecuba. Names. The archaeology gives you 10,000. The unnamed ones. Grain measurers and textile workers and bronzesmiths, children in the streets, old men watching the sea from the lower walls, priests tending the temple fires, merchants arguing about the toll with the captains of the waiting ships. 10,000 people who experienced the end of their city, not as the culmination of a heroic narrative. And here's what I find I can't quite adequately describe. The texture of that gap, the distance between what the poem preserves and what the fire actually consumed. It's something like holding the poem in one hand and the archaeology in the other and feeling the weight difference, which is not quite the image I wanted, but I'm leaving it. 10,000 people for whom the burning was just the end of their specific, particular, ordinary lives. The pot on the hearth, the loom in the corner, the oil lamp, the dropped spindle whirl, the child's toy in the ash. Those are Troy. Troy without the poetry. And they are also, in their way, a poem. The Bronze Age collapse. I have to cover this. It's where the fall of Troy lives in its actual historical context, and it matters enormously for understanding the scale of what happened. And I will try to give it the attention it deserves, while being honest that this is the section I find hardest to make feel as urgent as it is, because the collapse of interconnected systems it resists the narrative grip that a burning city has. It spreads across decades and geographies, and it keeps slipping out of a frame just when you think you have it. The Palace of Mycenae, destroyed and abandoned. Tyrants, destroyed. Pylos, destroyed. And here is the detail that keeps me up. The detail I cannot stop thinking about. The Linear B tablets at Pylos, the last administrative records of that palace, include emergency measures, redistributed rowers, watchers posted to coastal defense positions, the measures of a bureaucracy responding to a known threat in the hours or days before it arrived. Someone at Pylos knew what was coming and organized a response, and the response was insufficient, and the palace burned, and the tablets baked in the fire and survived, and we read them now, 3,000 years later, the last bureaucratic thoughts of a civilization that was about to stop existing. A ghost of something almost surfaces here, some contemporary vocabulary for this specific kind of institutional document, the last memo before the building goes dark, and I pull back from it. The ancient world has its own weight. It doesn't need the comparison. The Hittite Empire, gone. Hattusa, their capital, destroyed so completely the city was never reoccupied. Ugarit, the great Syrian trading city, destroyed. And in the ruins, unsent letters. Letters calling for help from neighboring kingdoms. Letters describing an attack from the sea. The last words of a civilization addressed to other civilizations that were themselves collapsing at the moment the letters were written and never sent and buried under the ash for 3,000 years until someone found them. The cause? Drought, probably in part. Paleoclimatology has found a significant drying event across the eastern Mediterranean in this period. Multi-generational, the kind of drought that grinds the agricultural base of palace economies into dust over decades. The sea peoples, waves of migrants and raiders from the north and west, themselves displaced by whatever was displacing civilizations, recorded in Egyptian sources, attacking the Nile Delta. Internal revolt, possibly. The redistributive palace economy could feel from inside it like something close to forced labor, and the collapse of the controlling structures might have been experienced by many as relief. System collapse as the synthesis. The Bronze Age world was so tightly interconnected, so dependent on every part of the network functioning, that when enough nodes failed simultaneously, the whole thing had no resilience left, no redundancy, nowhere to substitute. It stopped. That's what collapse looks like from the outside, from 3,000 years away. It stopped The tin stopped coming from Afghanistan. The copper stopped coming from Cyprus. The grain routes broke. The diplomatic correspondence between kings, who called each other brother, ceased. The writing disappeared. The palace administrators, who had kept linear B tablets recording grain quantities for specific workers on specific days, they stopped keeping records, and eventually they stopped knowing how to keep records, and eventually the knowledge of how to write at all was gone, and the Greeks of the classical period 500 years later, the ones who built the Parthenon and argued philosophy and wrote the tragedies, those Greeks had no memory of the Bronze Age that was not mythological. They only had the voice. The voice kept it. The poems carried forward across 500 years of smaller and darker and quieter, one mouth to one ear, generation after generation, the story of what had been there and what had burned and what the burning had meant. And eventually someone, Homer, or the tradition that crystallized into Homer, shaped the carrying into a fixed form, and the fixed form survived, and we have it, and it is still being told, in the dark, to people lying somewhere listening. The ash is in the ground, the tablets baked, the letters were never sent, the 10,000 have no names, the hill is still there. Troy fell into this collapse the way a city does, not with a single catastrophic moment you can point to, though there was fire, there was definitely fire. One domino among many, except that by some accident of geography, or the particular density of what happened there, or maybe just luck, terrible or otherwise, the storytellers chose that specific domino to make the frame for everything else, to hang the whole age on. Homer didn't write about the Bronze Age collapse. He didn't have a name for it. Nobody did. He wrote about a war, and about one man trying to get home from the war. Two human stories submerged inside the civilizational catastrophe without knowing they were submerged, and by attending to the human stories, by following them with enough precision, enough care for the specific detail, the specific grief, he preserved not just the stories, but the texture of the world they happened in, the smell of it, almost. The Iliad is the only detailed literary record we have of how the Bronze Age Aegean world looked and moved. Not a historical record, a mythological one, shaped by centuries of mouths before it was ever fixed. But the material culture, the bronze weapons, the boar tusk helmets, the palace architecture, the honor economy, the particular aristocratic code that made certain men unable to back down from certain things. Archaeology has confirmed much of it. Homer remembered things he didn't know he was remembering, preserved in the amber of epic verse details of a world that the people who came after him had forgotten was real, had forgotten was anything other than metaphor. That's the thing that gets me, honestly, every time I come back to it. The oral tradition was the technology the collapse could not kill. Writing went with the palaces. Linear B vanished when the palace bureaucracies that needed it vanished, and Greece had no writing system for 4 or 5 centuries after that. The whole Greek alphabet arriving only later, borrowed from Phoenicia, adapted. The eventual medium in which Homer's poems were finally fixed, and which became the alphabet in which I am, anyway. The stories survived the gap. They moved in mouths, across the dark centuries, in the particular technology of oral composition, formulas and epithets, the repeated phrases that are both decoration and structural support, the wine-dark sea and the rosy-fingered dawn and swift-footed Achilles recurring with reliability that scholars have analyzed as load-bearing, the units of a system for maintaining long narratives without paper. The singers who carried Troy through the dark were doing something whose scale is almost impossible to hold in your mind. They were the archive. They were the whole library, the only institution that made it. And what they carried wasn't simple. They carried the moral ambiguity whole, which surprises me still, which I find I can't fully account for. The Greeks in the Iliad are also sacrilegious and cowardly and rapacious, men whose glory is built on a foundation that the poem doesn't bother to hide. The Trojans made choices. Let Paris bring Helen home, decided to keep her when returning her might have ended it, made that calculation poorly, and suffered and failed and had their own interior lives of cowardice and wisdom. The gods take sides for personal reasons, intervene with a casualness about human cost that is, it's genuinely disturbing if you follow it to its end. The oral tradition preserved all of this without resolving it, carried it forward unresolved. Because the unresolved nature of it was the point, I think, though I'm not entirely sure I can say why. Something about how the question had to stay a question. The same unanswerable burning question the ash layer has been holding under his sarlik for 3,000 years. What are you willing to do for the thing you want? What are you willing to lose in the getting of it? And when you have it, when you're standing in the ash of everything the wanting cost, holding the thing you fought for in the middle of the ruin the fighting made, what then? Was it enough? Was it ever gonna be enough? Was the thing you wanted even the thing you needed? Because in the ash, those two things always seem to have been different. Not interestingly different, not philosophically different, just different in the way that makes you sit down. What do you do in the morning? After the fire? In the city that's gone? In the life that is different now from what it was before you wanted the thing badly enough to start the war? Let me collect the thread here. These are the questions Troy has been holding, not the Hittite records, though those records, the mentions of Wilusa, the treaty with Alexandru, who may or may not be the Alexandros, who is also Paris, are extraordinary, are genuinely extraordinary in what they confirm. Not the scholarship. The scholarship tells you Troy was real. That matters. But the myth tells you why that matters. And why it matters isn't because the Bronze Age is interesting, which it is, but because the architecture of desire and consequence the war describes is not Bronze Age architecture. It belongs to the specific experience of being a person who wants something in a world where the cost of wanting doesn't come printed on the outside of the box, where the protection of the walls is also the prison of the walls, where the thing that comes through the gate promising to end the war brings the war inside. Anyway, near the center of the Troy, 6 citadel, the hilltop, the inner layers, archaeologists found a large, well-built structure, stone pillars, substantial construction. They call it the Pillar House. It's been interpreted as a palace, or at least an administrative center. Priam's palace, possibly, in the sense that the building in that location in that period is the building that would have been Priam's palace if Priam existed, which is itself a sentence that tells you something about how myth and archaeology have to talk to each other. Troy has no linear B tablets. Troy's writing, if Troy had writing, has not survived. The Hittite records are Hittite, not Trojan. What survives is material: walls, floors, broken pots, personal objects, the physical residue of 10,000 people who did not leave extensive textual records of themselves, or whose records haven't been found, or whose records were on something the fire ate. Troy is still mostly silence. That's the bald fact. A productive silence. A silence that has given us more than anyone in 1800 would have believed possible. But silence. The stories that fill it come from outside. Homer, the Greek tragedians, Virgil, who gave Troy a second life by making the Trojan hero Aeneas the ancestor of Rome, gave the destruction retrospective meaning, made the burning of Ilium the founding condition of a civilization that would last another 12 centuries. The Trojans survive in Virgil, not in Troy, but in Rome. Loss as seed, ash as origin. There is something there that something there I keep circling without quite being able to name. And I've tried several times tonight already, and maybe it's one of those things that belongs to the work of reading rather than the work of explaining. This is Troy's longest afterlife. The idea of the lost city. The idea that underneath the ordinary surface of the world, there are layers of buried magnificence, held in trust by soil against the possibility of discovery. Schliemann turned this into obsession and then into an excavation, and the obsession was partly shameless exploitation and partly also the most genuine faith imaginable. He believed in Troy, the way that moves Earth, literally moves it, and in moving it found not just Troy, but the proof that the Earth keeps things, that myth and archaeology are sometimes pointing at the same real thing from different angles, and the distance between them is not always as large as the careful scholars of the 19th century wanted it to be. They were not wrong to be skeptical, those scholars. The evidence before Schliemann didn't support the existence of a Bronze Age city at the specific location Homer implied. The reasonable conclusion was no such city. The reasonable conclusion was wrong, not because the standards were bad, because the evidence was incomplete, because the evidence was in the ground, keeping its own counsel, holding the ash layer and the dropped spindle whirl. I don't know why I keep coming back to the spindle whirl. Some woman dropped it mid-task. It's a small thing. Until someone came looking. The myth was preserving information that it had no other medium. Was, in the most literal sense, true. True the way a long memory is true. True the way a story told 10,000 times in the dark still carries, somewhere inside its telling, the shape of the original event. The ash is in the ground, the tablets baked. What we have is what the mouths kept, 1-to-1, dark centuries, smaller and quieter, until the shape fixed, until we have it, still being told. And this is what the night carries finally in the space after the story and before sleep. The question of what your own myths are keeping. What information is folded into the stories you tell yourself, about your past, about the forces that shaped you before you had words for them. What burn layer is held in the substrate of the person you are now? What ash of an old fire? what residue of something that mattered enormously and is now covered by the subsequent layers of everything that came after. The way Troy 7 sits on top of Troy 6. The way the ordinary accumulates over the catastrophic until you'd never know the catastrophe was there without digging. The archaeologist's method is patience and small tools and attention to context. You can hold the most extraordinary object from the ancient world, and if you don't know what layer it came from, what was beside it when it was found, you've lost most of what it means. Context is almost everything. I've been thinking about whether the same patience applies to the interior excavation, whether the same care can be brought to personal stratigraphy, and I keep arriving at the same place, which is that I don't know, and the not knowing feels important to keep rather than resolve. Whether it's possible to find the pillar house at the center of your own citadel, whether the arrangement of stones tells you something about the civilization that built it. The night doesn't answer this. The night holds questions of this scale rather than answering them, provides the dark and the quiet in which they become, I want to say manageable, but that's too small, in which they become something you can rest alongside. Troy burns in the dark, but it's burning very far away and very long ago. And between that fire and this moment is 3,000 years of people who found the story worth returning to, who lay in the space between wakefulness and sleep and let the questions move through them, who woke up the next morning in a world that was theirs, ordinary, full of unresolved things, and went on. I need to pause here. The Scammander. I keep wanting to rush past the Scammander because it feels like an epilogue detail, a closing image, and it's more than that. It's doing something I find genuinely hard to describe. The river that runs through the plain below Troy, the Greeks called it Xanthos, the golden one, for the color of its water in certain light. That river has been silting up the bay for 30 centuries. The plain is now miles wide, where it was once a harbor, alluvial deposit. The daily ordinary work of moving sediment from mountains to sea, layer by layer, the way ordinary time always deposits itself, building the plain on which Virgil imagined the Trojan dead still wandering, still not arrived anywhere restful. The sea is gone from the view at Hisarlik, the geography that made Troy Troy, the promontory above the strait, the visibility from water, slowly erased by the same process that preserved the walls. The earth keeps and the earth changes, and in all of that the hill stays, the walls stay, the question stays. The question Laocoon was trying to ask when the serpents stopped him. The question Cassandra was answering when no one was listening, which is a thing I keep finding this. I keep finding Cassandra more difficult to think about clearly than any other figure in this story. And I'm not sure I can tell you why, without sounding like I'm reaching for something I haven't earned. She saw truly. She spoke truly. She was heard by the future rather than the present. And she had to. She had to live inside the gap between her accuracy and its reception, which is its own kind of anyway. The ash layer is still there, the thin, dark, carbon-rich band in the stratigraphy at Hisarlik, between Troy 7a and what came after. Indifferent to mythology, indifferent to the 3,000 years of scholarship and story that have accumulated above it. It simply persists. The fact at the bottom of all the interpretation, the real thing under all the stories, the silence at the center of the most famous noise in the ancient world. Troy burned. Walls, real. Ash, real. Question, real. So there. Anyway, the night is long enough to hold all of it. The dark is wide enough to carry the smoke of a fire that went out 3,000 years ago, which is a clumsy way to say something true. The smoke is gone, obviously. What I mean is the dark is wide enough for the fact of the fire to be present without crushing anything. And the question about the gate, your gate, the one you have been standing in front of for however many years the siege has been running, does not require resolution tonight. It requires something quieter than resolution. The sitting with it. The honest weight of something real pressing without demanding an answer in the next 10 minutes. The next episode goes into the underworld, the one the Trojans believed in, the Greeks believed in, every ancient Mediterranean civilization built into the architecture of their understanding of what existence was. The kingdom beneath, the river between, the asphodel meadows where Achilles walks, and where he says something about glory and life that I don't want to say more than that. It changes the meaning of what came before it. It's worth coming back for. Let the smoke from the hill on the Hellespont stay out here in the night where it belongs. Let the walls stand in the dark at their angle, holding their weight, keeping their counsel, as they have kept it for 30 centuries, underground. Let Cassandra's voice be the last thing through the space before sleep. The quality of it, someone who sees clearly and is heard by the future rather than the present. You are in the future she was speaking to. You have always been. The hill at Hisarlik catches the Aegean light earlier than the plain around it. Promontories do. High places receive the dawn before the land below. The walls catch it first, still standing, still keeping what the earth gave them to keep. Good night.